Welcome everyone, this is Lou, and you're listening to the Francophone Perspectives podcast, a podcast which explores the diversity of Francophones and Francophiles' path in Philadelphia. Today, we meet Julien Suaudeau, a college teacher who works on racism, terrorism, and colonization. Julien defines for us the multiple jobs that he has, explains how he came to be interested in these themes, and how they relate to France, thus giving us an interesting perspective on the differences between France and the United States. Have a good listening! Bonjour Julien Suaudeau, welcome to the podcast and thank you so much for having accepted my invitation.
Thank you for having me too.
Okay, so let's get started with the presentations. Could you introduce yourself in a few sentences, in any way you wish?
So my name is Julien Suaudeau. I was born in Évreux in Normandy in France, all the way back in the 20th century. Don't try to pronounce the name of my hometown. And most importantly, don't look it up on the map unless you want a glimpse of absolute French nothingness. I won't elaborate on that. I am I guess I could say I'm a transatlantic creature who does its best to combine French grumpiness and signature pessimism with a touch of American let's get to business, no nonsense ethics. That's basically who I am today, but my answer could be different if you asked again tomorrow or if you had asked yesterday.
That was a good presentation. It gives us a good idea of who you are. So let's get interested in what you do. You have been having various jobs in your career and you are working on many different fields. Although I've tried to define them, I think it's still the best solution if you tell us a little bit more about your work.
So I teach at Bryn Mawr College, just outside Philadelphia. I write books, fiction and nonfiction, all of them in French. As a person who writes and teaches, I work on the very cheerful topics of terrorism, colonialism, and racism and anti-racism. For my students, it means being exposed to, I would say, the invisible layers of that thing called France. That very hard. It's very hard to understand and to grasp. For my readers, that means exploring the dark areas of the French psyche and the blind spots of French history beyond the mythology of the great French narrative, what we call roman national. Literature is, I think, for me, a very powerful tool to consider evil, to investigate and document evil. And when I say evil, I don't mean an external force that needs to be destroyed, more as a demon, as a force within, inside every of us. And the evildoers in my novels, they can be terrorists or they can be colonizers, they can be jihadis or they can be slave owners. They're not monsters. They are average people who go down a labyrinth with a monstrous act in the middle, in the center of that labyrinth.
So thank you for the very much complete clarification on your work. I'm curious how one's become interested in this kind of issues. Like, would you know where that comes from? What led you to explore this evil in average people?
So I started working on those themes because of how, pardon my French, how obviously fucked up our world is. If you look at terrorism, the standard response to it in France and the US is to curb individual liberties, expand the surveillance state, identify scapegoat communities. If you look at colonialism in term and racism, from an international law standpoint, colonization ended in the 1960s and the 1970s, but the resilience of colonial power structures is visible everywhere. Now, as as a teacher and a writer, I really don't have, at least I don't think I have the agency to fix that. And I don't think my task is necessarily to raise awareness or sound the alarm. That's not my thing. What I can do is tell stories, and this is what I like to do. And with those stories, lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. According to James Baldwin, because I'm quoting him right now, this is the very purpose of art. Lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. So, writing for me is about finding the right voices and making those voices heard beyond judgment again. Teaching is not that different. You take a study object, any given study object, and you try to present it to students in ways that will invite them to consider unfamiliar perspectives and to exercise their critical thinking skills. And deconstructing, in that sense, is the opposite of destruction. It's about taking a step back, posing, and building a sturdier, more complex, inclusive structure, intellectual structure. And that can be done, I think, at any level of a world language class curriculum.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it can be done in any country. You have been both working in France and United States. And I would like to focus on your experience here in Philadelphia. So, when did you first arrive and what led you to move here?
Sure. So I arrived in Philadelphia in 2006, 15 years ago. The previous 3 years of my life had been very intense, dedicated to finishing my first film, a documentary titled Il était une fois en Côte d'Ivoire, Once Upon a Time in the Ivory Coast. And there was a sense of fatigue that set in, not just with the film and my professional career, but with my life in France. I felt I knew every aspect of that life inside out, so to speak, and that I needed to explore new horizons, for lack of a better word. On a deeper level, and looking back on how our lives and careers played out, it's obvious now to me that I wanted to put some distance between myself and France. Not because I was tired or sick of it, but because I had to be somewhere else to actually get it, to see France as it is. It jumped at me when I came to Philly. That's when I started writing on terrorism and also on the various toxic mythologies about French identity. Um, in the singular when it's actually a multiplicity and there's so many of them, and especially the idea that non-white French citizens are supposed to blend in, l'intégration, and are always thought of as immigrants d'origine étrangère issus de l'immigration when that's not expected from white French citizens. That was really my discovery, my awakening when I moved to Philadelphia. I was not aware of that, not as much, not with the same intensity while I was still living in Paris.
Yeah, yeah, I get you. As you said, moving to the United States offered you the opportunity to step back and have another view on French issues. So, I'm curious, how is it to work on issues such as racism, terrorism that might still be about France, but in the American context? Because obviously, I guess these two countries have different ways of dealing with these issues.
Right. So I think it's different for racism and terrorism. For terrorism, I think that it's not that different in the sense that the terrorist, that socially constructed figure, is always perceived as the other, in the sense that it cannot be me, I cannot be that person, and it cannot be us. That self-distancing is the fundamental premise of the neoconservative paradigm of the war on terror. This is George W. Bush circa 2001. and the invasion of Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. But this is also how France and the French government responded to the 2015 attacks and in the years that followed with a paradigm that was very similar to what the US did after 9/11. As for racism and the crimes of colonization, I agree, there is a major difference between France and the US. And probably one element of that difference, a key element, is that slavery and war atrocities during the colonial conquest happened both in France and the US, yes, but in the US that took place on the mainland. So it's impossible to ignore the continuity between past and present. You are surrounded by evidence of that violent history. In France, it happened in the colonies, which is why we're still disconnected from the history of colonization and slavery. And this distance enables both denial and amnesia, but it also muffles the counter narratives that could weaken the Roman National, that great French narrative. And also, in addition, it creates a sense of post-colonial melancholy in the words of Paul Gilroy, the British sociologist. Uh, that nostalgia for France as it was, or as we supposed it was, the equivalent of the American "Make America Great Again." We're seeing a change today in recent years in history books and elsewhere, a greater sense of awareness to these issues, primarily thanks to the work of scholars, as you mentioned in your question. But there are still these scholars, the academics that are doing the work on the colonial history, are still under the suspicion of importing American political correctness, wokeism, cancel culture, all these cultural scarecrows that French officials and a lot of journalists actually swing around as threats to the Republican model. You hear these big, scary words: repentance, guilt trip, concurrence victimaire, victim competition. Uh, this is not about a guilt trip or about a competition between memories of genocide. It's not about white people carrying the burden of colonial crimes. I think, in my opinion, it's about everyone in post-colonial countries knowing how these countries came to be post-colonial, and how we came to be as post-colonial peoples. It is our responsibility to know that history, to research it, to teach it, and to share it. And it is very dangerous, if you ask me, that political actors everywhere are trying to deny the responsibility of the French Republic in those colonial crimes, as if only the Ancien Régime, the monarchy, and the empire, Napoleon, were to blame. The Third and Fourth Republic killed thousands of people in Algeria, in Vietnam, in Madagascar, in Cameroon. And that did not end with the Fifth Republic, the republic that we are in right now. Um, Take Guadeloupe in 1967. The authorities gunned down demonstrators during a strike movement. The historians who investigated the massacre, wrote that the death toll can be anywhere over 300. So this is just an example. We need to open our eyes and understand that coloniality, the colonial state of things, did not end with colonization.
Well, thank you for all your answers. It was extremely interesting to get to see the differences between France and the United States in terms of racism, history. Now I would like to focus on your experience here as an immigrant in the United States, and especially on the cultural differences that you might have experienced. So, did you have any cultural shock when you first came here? Like any, what is or what are the things that surprised you the most?
So there's a lot of of different things that put me in a state of shock in the
Mhm.
US. But what strikes me the most is just the breathtaking scope of injustice, poverty, and decaying public spaces and infrastructure. For several years, I supervised a volunteer program in a local Kensington elementary school with Bryn Mawr students. And that experience taught me two very contrasted lessons. The first one is that there is no such thing as the American dream. It's a very toxic mythology that feels extremely out of sync and insulting after 4 years of Donald Trump. Uh, on the other hand, there is an unlimited supply of resilience in the US, and perhaps it's related to the fact that institutions, schools, hospitals, public transport are failing the very people that they're supposed to serve. But that courage is also part of the US. Something else I have noticed, and that my wife and I often discuss, is that I don't know, I'm not sure how to say this nicely. Most Americans that I know have no clue how not to do anything. Just just hang out, not to be in productive mode.
Yeah.
L'art de ne rien faire, l'art de glander in French, and boredom as such has an intrinsic value that doesn't exist, that is not recognized here in the US because of that injunction to be productive, to perform, to compete.
Mhm.
And you can't stop, never, under no circumstances. You have to keep going.
Yeah, you know what? That's kind of funny because this is not the first time I talk about cultural differences between France and United States with people, and people often bring up like this lenteur de vivre, this art de vivre of doing nothing. So yeah, I'm not surprised that you mentioned it. I was about to ask you about the thing that you prefer in both France and United States, but you maybe you kind of answer like it might be this resilience on the one hand for United States and this lenteur de vivre, the slow life for France. So let's keep exploring this double experience in the United States and in France. Um, what would be your favorite place or the activity you would recommend the most here in Philadelphia and in your country of origin? So either in your hometown, Évreux, or in Paris, where you lived for a while.
So I thought hard on this, and here's my answer. If you love France, aside from the Alliance Française,
Mhm.
definitely the Café Lutetia on 23rd and Lombard. They make the most delicious viennoiseries, so pain au chocolat, croissant, that you will be able to have in Philadelphia. And I'm very fond of John and Valerie, who have been owning the place for 30 years now. As for my hometown, I will just suggest your listeners to find the place. I will dare your listeners to find the place that was not blown up by the Germans or bombed by the Allies on their way in. And if they get their answers right, I don't know, I'll send them a copy of my book.
Okay, so you will now have to hold your end of the bargain if it ever happens. So we get into the end of this podcast. So let's talk about perspectives for the future. Do you have any coming project that you could share with us, or like what can we wish you for the future?
Um, so I have a new book coming out this January with my colleague and friend Mam Fatou Nyong from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. It's a very short essay in which we deconstruct universalism as a Eurocentric ideology, and we propose a framework for reinventing it as a genuinely inclusive concept for the 21st century. So this is the short term. Beyond the near future, I'm working on several projects. I'm working on an anthology of white noise as in colonialist noise archives, written documents in which iconic US or French or Spanish or Portuguese or Dutch figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Napoleon, Jules Ferry, Ernest Renan develop white supremacist views explicitly. And I'm aside from that, I'm working on a project called the invention of the postcolonial city and public spaces. If you look at statues that came down in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd everywhere in the U.S. but also globally, what are we supposed to do with that heritage? And as for fiction, I am working on a new novel. It's the first that is set in North America, but all the way back in the 17th century, and it's my very personal and maybe radical attempt to offer a narrative that will run against the mainstream vision of how this country, the U.S., came to be. Um, in terms of what you can wish me for the future, uh, first of all, this is very nice of you. Maybe I would say maybe more being more mindful, getting better at my daily stretching routine. And if the people in the know and the people who have the power to do so could bring back High Street on Market, my favorite restaurants who did not survive the pandemic, I would be thrilled. Um, Maybe also bring Stromae and Angèle to Philadelphia when they tour for their next album. That would be super nice.
Okay, so my best wishes for the release of your book, and I keep my fingers crossed for the ice cream and the concerts. Thank you so much, Julien Suaudeau, for having answered all my questions. That was extremely interesting, and I'm sure that our community will agree with me. So yeah, thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having listened to the Alliance podcast, et à bientôt.